People ask me a version of the same question all the time. Should I start with stocks or should I start with real estate? And when they ask me that, I usually ask a different question back. Why are you asking now? That question matters more than people think, because the reason is usually not analytical. It is emotional. Someone they know just made money in the stock market, or someone they know just bought a rental property. Or they saw a video where a person with confidence and a whiteboard made real estate look like a machine that prints money. Suddenly, the subject appears everywhere. That is not always because the opportunity just appeared. Very often it is because your mind just started noticing it. There is a name for that. Some people call it the Bader-Meinhof phenomenon. Others call it frequency illusion. It is the strange way the brain works when something becomes relevant. You decide you might want a certain truck, and suddenly that truck is on every road. It was always there. You simply were not paying attention before. The same thing happens with investing. When a person begins thinking about stocks, the world begins to look full of stocks. When a person begins thinking about rental property, the world begins to look full of landlords. Their friend who owns a duplex suddenly seems like a genius. Their coworker who bought a stock that doubled suddenly seems like he discovered a law of nature. But the danger is this. When your brain starts noticing an opportunity, it often mistakes noticing for understanding. That is how people get hurt. They think, I am seeing this everywhere now, therefore this must be the thing I should do. Now, that is not how I think about money. I try to ask a more useful question. What is the right sequence? Not what is exciting, not what my neighbor is doing, not what the current market is rewarding, not what the algorithm is throwing in front of my eyes because I clicked one video about rental houses. What is the order that gives me the greatest chance to build skill, reduce the risk of ruin, maintain liquidity, and compound over long periods of time? That question leads me to a conclusion that many real estate people do not like, even though I like real estate very much. For most beginners, I would start with stocks. Not because real estate is bad. Real estate can be one of the greatest wealth-building tools in the entire tax code. It can give you leverage. It can give you cash flow. It can give you depreciation. It can give you control. It can create wealth for families over generations. But when I am talking to someone at the beginning, I do not begin with the tool that can damage them most if they use it incorrectly. I begin with the tool that lets them learn. That is the principle. The first job of a beginner is not to maximize return. The first job of a beginner is to survive long enough to become competent. Stocks, if used intelligently, can be a very good school. When you buy even a small number of shares in a company like Coca-Cola, something changes in your mind. Before that, Coca-Cola was just a drink in a red can. After that, Coca-Cola becomes a living business. You start paying attention to its earnings. You notice its dividend, you wonder what a payout ratio is, you hear someone mention price to earnings, and suddenly it is not an abstract term anymore. Why? Because now you have skin in the game. That is how competence begins. Competence does not usually begin by watching 10 more videos. It does not begin by reading a thread online written by someone who may or may not know what he is talking about. It does not begin by sitting around with your friends repeating phrases that sound intelligent. It begins when you own something and your brain says this. Now matters to me that relevance turns information into education. I have seen this across many areas of life. You can explain a concept to a person for years and it slides right past them. Then they put money at risk, and suddenly the same concept becomes clear in an afternoon. The information did not change. Their relationship to the That is why I like stocks as a starting point. You can begin small, you can make small mistakes, you can learn how businesses report results, you can learn what cash flow means, you can learn why a dividend is not free money. You can learn why valuation matters. You can learn why a company can be great and still be a bad purchase at the wrong price. And if you need liquidity, you can usually get it. That matters. People underestimate liquidity until the day they need it. If you buy shares of a public company today and you need the money 3 months from now, you can sell the shares. You may sell at a gain or a loss. That part is not guaranteed. But the exit exists. If you buy a rental property today and you need the money 3 months from now, that is a very different conversation. You cannot push a button and liquidate a duplex. You have inspections, you have agents, you have closing timelines, you have buyers, you have financing contingencies, you have the possibility that you need cash right at the moment. The market is soft or your property has a problem. Liquidity is not a luxury for a beginner. Liquidity is protection. It gives you room for error. And when you are new, room for error is not optional. It is survival. I have seen people turn a small problem into a catastrophic one because they had no liquidity. Something that should have been a road bump became a crisis. The car needed repair, a tenant stopped paying, a roof leaked. A family emergency appeared. They had all of their capital locked inside something they could not sell without pain. That panic destroys good decision making and bad decision. Making destroys wealth. That is one reason I prefer the beginner to start with a liquid learning vehicle. But there is another reason, and it is just as important. The learning curve in stocks is often more forgiving. People fool themselves with real estate because they can touch it. They think, I understand houses, I have lived in a house, I know what a kitchen is, I know what rent is, therefore I understand real estate. Understanding what a house is and understanding real estate investing are not the same thing. Real estate done properly requires understanding the market. The financing, the reserves, the insurance, the tenants, the maintenance, the legal structure, the property manager, the vacancy rate, the capital expenditures, the taxes, the local laws, the eviction process, and the cash flow. If you get one of those wrong, the mistake can become expensive very quickly. If you buy a stock and you are wrong, the value of the stock can go down. In a bad case, you can lose what you invested. That is not pleasant, but it is contained. If you buy a property and you are wrong, you can lose more than the initial capital you put in. The tenant can stop paying, the tenant can damage the property, the tenant can sue you, the roof can need replacement. The air conditioning can fail in the middle of the summer, the local government can raise property taxes, insurance can jump, a legal issue can appear, and while all of that is happening, the mortgage still wants its payment. That is a very different risk structure. That is not a reason to avoid real estate forever. It is a reason not to walk into it casually. The sequence matters. When I think about lasting wealth, I think in buckets. I do not like people becoming all one thing, all real estate, all stocks, all cash, all crypto, all one strategy that happens to be working right now. That is not a system. That is concentration dressed up as conviction. The framework I like is a diversified structure that roughly divides capital into several major roles. One part should go toward income, producing stocks. These are businesses that can pay you. Businesses that have profits, businesses that send some of those profits back to the owners. If structured properly, that stock bucket can give you dividends, option income, and long-term appreciation. Another part can go toward real estate. Not because real estate is magic, but because it is different. It behaves differently. It has different tax treatment. It can use leverage. It can produce rents. It can be managed and improved. It can be passed down with planning advantages. Another part can go toward managed money. That may mean an advisor, it may mean low-cost ETFs, it may mean syndications, it may mean a structure where somebody else is making some of the decisions so that your entire financial life is not dependent on your own judgment every hour of every day. And then there must be a reserve bucket cash or cash equivalents. Dry powder, something that gives you options. The model is not complicated. The discipline is complicated. I like the idea of roughly 30% in income, producing stocks, 30% in real estate or real estate. Like exposure, 30% in managed money and 10% in cash or equivalents. Do not turn those numbers into religion. The point is not that every household must match the percentages perfectly. The point is the logic. You want cash flow, you want assets, you want diversification, you want liquidity, you want a system that does not break when one part of the world stops behaving nicely. But if you are just starting, you cannot build the whole machine overnight. So the question becomes, where do you start? I would usually start with stocks. Again, not speculation, not gambling, not whatever your brother-in-law said at the gym, not the stock that moved 20% yesterday, not some internet narrative that sounds exciting because it uses the words artificial intelligence and next generation in the same sentence. I mean quality, I mean boring, I mean companies with long records of paying and increasing dividends, companies that have been through recessions, inflation, rate cycles, market panics, and still found a way to send cash back to owners. There are companies called dividend aristocrats. These are companies that have increased their dividends for at least 25 consecutive years. Then there are dividend kings, which have done it for at least 50 years. Companies like Coca-Cola, Johnson & Johnson, Procter & Gamble. These are not new ideas. That is part of the point when you are learning. Boring can be very useful. Boring lets you observe the machine. I do not want the beginner to start by trying to predict which tiny technology company will become the next giant. That may be exciting, but excitement is a poor teacher. Excitement makes people confuse motion with progress. I want the beginner to learn what a business looks like when it has durable cash flow, so I would ask questions. Does the stock yield at least a modest amount in dividends? Is that dividend covered by real earnings and cash flow? Has the company paid consistently? Has it increased the dividend over time? Is revenue stable? Is the company still relevant? Is the valuation reasonable? Is the price to earnings ratio in a range that makes sense for that company and its industry? Is the chart in a stable or upward channel rather than collapsing? Are analysts broadly constructive rather than overwhelmingly negative? Does the stock have options if I want to learn how to create additional income through covered calls or cash secured puts? Those are not magical questions. They are screening questions. They force you to think like an owner that matters, because investing is not about collecting symbols on a screen. It is about owning claims on cash flows, assets, and future decisions. If you do not understand what you own, you do not really own an investment. You own a hope, and hope is not a strategy. The beauty of starting with stocks is that you can learn this in increments. You can buy a small position, you can read the reports, you can watch how the stock behaves around earnings, you can watch how the dividend is announced, you can learn what happens when interest rates rise, when margins compress, when revenue slows, when guidance changes. The lessons come with numbers attached. That makes them real. And once you have done that for a while, you become a different person. You no longer hear words like valuation, yield, trend, options, and cash flow as jargon. You hear them as tools. You begin to see patterns. That is how financial competence develops. It is not because you became a genius. It is because you paid attention with skin in the game. Now, let me be very clear about real estate. I love real estate when it is done correctly. The tax code has treated real estate very generously for a long time. Depreciation can shelter income. Bonus depreciation can create large deductions in certain circumstances. Leverage can allow you to control a larger asset with less capital. A properly structured real estate portfolio can produce cash flow, appreciation, tax advantages, and estate planning benefits. There are strategies like 1031 exchanges that can defer taxes when you move from one property to another. There is step up in basis in estate planning. There are structures that allow wealth to be built and transferred in ways that stocks do not always match. I am not anti-real estate. I am anti-beginner blow-up. Those are different things. A person saves $20,000 or $30,000. They watch a few videos. They hear someone say that owning rental property is the path to freedom. They buy a cheap rental in a market they do not understand. The first tenant stops paying, the air conditioner dies, the roof leaks, property taxes jump, the city sends a notice. Insurance renewal comes in higher. Suddenly the entire cushion is gone. Now they cannot sleep. That is not wealth building. That is stress acquisition. The problem is not that the property was evil. The problem is that the investor had no margin for error. If you own 10 properties and one needs a roof, the portfolio may absorb it. If you own one property and that roof is your entire cash reserve, that single event can change your life. That is sequence. That is why I want beginners to build liquidity and competence before taking on a liquid complexity. But if a person wants real estate exposure early, there are smarter ways to begin than buying a distressed house in a market they barely know. One method is house hacking. You buy a property you live in and you rent out part of it. Maybe it is a single-family house with extra rooms. Maybe it is a duplex where you live in one unit and rent the other. Maybe it is a small multifamily property where the other tenants help cover the mortgage. This gives you skin in the game, but it also gives you training wheels. You are not just buying a random rental far away and hoping the spreadsheet was honest. You are close to the asset. You are learning how tenants behave. You are learning what maintenance costs. You are learning how management works. It is still work. It is still risk. But it can be a more controlled way to learn. Another method is the live. In improvement strategy, you buy a primary residence that needs work. You live in it, you improve it over time. You stay long enough to qualify for the capital gain exclusion under the home sale rules. If the rules apply to your situation, then you sell and move to the next one. This is not flipping in the traditional sense. It is using the fact that you need a place to live anyway and turning that housing cost into a wealth-building tool. You are getting utility from the house while potentially building equity if done well. The tax treatment can be very favorable. That can work for certain people, especially those willing to live through renovation, inconvenience, and patience. A third method is to use REITs, real estate investment trusts. A REIT allows you to own exposure to real estate with the liquidity of a publicly traded stock. You are not fixing toilets. You are not replacing roofs directly. You are not dealing with an individual tenant. You are owning shares in a company that owns or finances real estate. That does not mean REITs are risk-free. They move with rates. They can be poorly managed, their properties can suffer, their dividends can be cut, but as a learning tool, they can be excellent. They let you observe how real estate behaves without trapping all your capital in one property. You can study a REIT the same way you study a company. What kind of property does it own? Apartments, shopping centers, industrial warehouses, offices, medical buildings. How much debt does it carry? What is the occupancy rate? What is the lease duration? What is the dividend history? How does it behave when rates rise? That is real estate education with liquidity. And for many beginners, that is a better first step than becoming a landlord before they know what a landlord actually does. Now, there is another mental trap I want to discuss because it is everywhere in investing. A writer named Michael Crichton describes something called the gel, man amnesia effect. The idea is simple. You read an article about a subject you know very well, and you notice the article is wrong or oversimplified. Then you turn the page and read another article about a subject you do not know, and you suddenly assume that one is accurate. That is dangerous. I have seen it in taxes. Someone who knows tax law reads a mainstream article about taxes and sees mistakes immediately. Then the same person reads an article about real estate investing or options or asset protection and accepts it as truth, because they do not know enough to see the errors. The internet makes this worse. Artificial intelligence can make it worse too if you do not know the subject well enough to detect hallucinations. That is why you need a system. You need numbers. You need principles. You need experience or access to people who have experience. You cannot build wealth by trusting every confident statement you hear. Real estate especially attracts oversimplification. People say, the property rents for $1,500 a month. That sounds good, but you do not get to keep $1,500 a month. You must subtract taxes, insurance, maintenance, management, vacancy, repairs, and capital expenditures. Sometimes half of the rent disappears before debt service. If $1,500 comes in, $750 may be the real number before the mortgage. Then that $750 still has to cover the debt payment. If the debt payment is higher than that, the deal is not cash flowing. It is a negative cash flow asset wearing a hopeful smile. If the math does not work, I do not want the deal. Period. That principle sounds obvious, but people violate it constantly because they fall in love with the story. They want to be a real estate investor. They want the identity. They want the social proof. They want to tell people they bought a rental. But the numbers do not care about your identity. The numbers either work or they do not. This is where stocks can train you before real estate. Stocks can teach you to look at cash flow, valuation, trends, payout ratios, margins, and balance sheets. They teach you that an asset is not good just because it exists. It is good only at the right price with the right risk and the right cash flow profile. That same thinking transfers to real estate. You learn to think like an investor instead of a consumer. I like the metaphor of buying chickens and eating the eggs. I do not want to eat the chickens. I want assets that produce cash flow. The stock pays a dividend. The property pays rent. The bond pays interest. The business generates profit. The asset is the chicken. The cash flow is the egg. Most people sell or consume the chicken because they never built the patience to live on the eggs. That is not a wealth-building system. So when I am advising someone conceptually, I think in a sequence. Start with stocks to build competence. Use dividend. Paying companies as a training ground. Keep liquidity. Learn how money behaves. Learn how businesses report. Learn how income streams work. Learn how markets move. Learn how your own emotions behave when prices go up and down. Then move into real estate intelligently. If you can house hack, consider that. If you can use a live-in improvement strategy and it fits your life, consider that. If you want exposure without direct landlord risk, consider REITs as a learning bridge. As your capital grows, move toward a more complete allocation, income-producing stocks, real estate or real estate equivalents, managed money, cash or cash equivalents. Not because those buckets are perfect, but because they give your financial life a structure that can endure different environments and keep cash as you go, not only at the end. People misunderstand cash. Cash is not always a return asset. It is an option asset. It lets you act when opportunity appears. It lets you survive when something goes wrong. It lets you avoid selling a good asset at a bad time. If you have $50,000 in stocks and no cash, you may be forced to sell stocks when life demands liquidity. If you have $50,000 in stocks and $5,000 in reserves, you have more control. Control matters. The larger your portfolio becomes, the more these buckets matter. If you had $1 million portfolio, a structure might include $300,000 in income-producing stocks or similar cash-flowing securities, $300,000 in real estate or real estate exposure, $300,000 in managed money or diversified strategies, and $100,000 in cash or equivalents. The exact numbers can change, the thinking should not. You want to avoid being dependent on one outcome. That is the difference between a portfolio and a bet. A bet says, this one thing must work. A portfolio says, I do not need one thing to work perfectly because I have built resilience. That is how serious investors think. They do not chase another person's chapter 20 when they are still in chapter 1. They do not put all their capital into a move they do not understand because someone online made it look easy. They do not confuse a market that is going up with personal competence. That is one of the most important lessons in investing. A rising market can make a beginner feel wise. Then a downturn reveals that they were only lucky. Competence is not proven by making money in one season. Competence is proven by surviving different seasons without destroying yourself. Stocks and real estate can both build wealth. The wrong sequence can destroy it. The right sequence can build skill, patience, confidence, and capital. So if you ask me, should I start with stocks or real estate, I will still ask you why you are asking now. If you are asking because you saw someone else make money, slow down. If you are asking because you want to build a lifetime system, then we can have a serious conversation. My answer, in principle, is this. Start where you can learn without being taken out. Start where you can build competence. Start where liquidity gives you room for error. Start with quality. Start with income. Start with boring businesses that make you pay attention. Use that ownership to train your mind. Then, as your capital and judgment grow, add real estate the smart way. The goal is not to win an argument about which asset class is better. The goal is to become the kind of person who can use both, because wealth is not built by loving stocks or loving real estate. Wealth is built by understanding sequence, managing risk, preserving liquidity, and buying assets that put money back into your life without requiring you to eat the chickens that laid the eggs. That is how I would think about it. And if you are serious, do not rush. Spend the time. 20 focused hours can make you competent enough to stop guessing, not an expert, not a master, but competent. Competent enough to see the obvious traps, competent enough to ask better questions, competent enough to avoid copying the loudest person in the room. That alone can change the trajectory of your financial life. Most people learn after the mistake. They buy the property they were not ready for. They buy the stock they did not understand. They chase the hot thing. They lose money. Then they become interested in risk management. I would rather learn before the mistake. That is the real advantage, not prediction, preparation.